we're talking about find the inverse. If we have a g function and it asked find g inverse of 3, notice that doesn't mean that you're going to find 3 on the x-axis and go up to where g is, because this is the g function. We want the inverse of that function. So if we do that, we can go ahead and plot what that will look like. The inverse of 0, 0 would be 0, 0. But on the g function, we have a point at 2, 1. So the inverse would be 1, 2. Similarly, we have a point at 4, 2. So we could find the inverse, which is now at 2, 4. There's a point at 5, 3. So I can put a point on the inverse at 3, 5. 6, 4 has an inverse of 4, 6. Then we just keep going. So 7, 5 has an inverse of 5, 7. And then you could keep going. 8, 6 would have an inverse of 6, 8. And it's kind of off the chart here. But we see it makes this shape, and it's very similar to what we have. But that's our g inverse function. And so when it says find g inverse of 3, that means 3 is now the input for the inverse. And I could go to 3 now on the x-axis and go up to the inverse, and it has an output of 5. So you could plot the inverse and then look at it this way. I could do g inverse of 5, go to 5 on the x-axis, and go up to the inverse function. And this one would be at 7. G inverse of 6 would mean I'm going to go to 6 on the x-axis and up to 8. So that's one way that we can consider this function, just by plotting the inverse before we start doing that. The other way to look at this is to say this was the original output of 3 for the g function, because remember, when we look at an inverse, we had x and y, and so some x value mapped to a y value in the original function. So that was our g of x function. G inverse is what takes that value back. So if I'm putting if I'm putting 3 into the inverse to figure out what that would map to, we could look at it with the original g of x function, because you're saying what x value would have mapped to 3 on the original g of x. And so if I consider it that way, I'd be going to 3 on my y-axis, because that was the original y value for g of x. And I find the associated x value, so that means that 5 was what mapped to 3, and so we still get the same answer of 5. Either way we look at it. So again, you could graph the function individually and then find your points, or you could think of it as you're finding what was mapped in the very beginning of the g of x function. Hopefully that helps a little bit.